It's my pleasure to be here today. And the question that I want to pose here is, why Nehru and Gandhi? After all, this obsession that we see today of appropriating and displacing is with both Nehru and Gandhi. And for this, I want to return to the 1940s as a decade that, and a moment that might tell us something about why the battle continues and the nature of the investment in that battle. I want to remind you that faced with the increasing acceptance of the two-nation theory in the 1940s and the communal violence preceding and following partition, many of Gandhi's earlier emphases and positions changed. From 16th August 1946, communal riots started in Calcutta, followed by Bombay, Noakhali, Bihar, Punjab, Delhi, with lakhs injured and killed and millions uprooted. Gandhi's last years, by which I indicate the 1940s till the time that he was killed, constitute an embryonic recognition that even a pluralist or reformed Hinduism could not be a binding force in a multi-religious society, and that violence destroyed or transformed the inside of all religions. In these years, he privileged the individual, chosen affiliations and willed transformations over and above his own earlier anti-modern, neo-Orientalist ascription of faith and tradition to the masses, and he took the Nehruvian secular on board in a way that not only changes received ideas about Gandhi, but also about the relationship between Nehru and Gandhi and about India's supposedly tradition-bound masses. From 1946, actually there are several strands here which were developing from earlier formulations by Gandhi, such as the individuation of the worshipper, syncretism, a separation of religion and politics from culture. But now in the 1940s they appear in a more developed form and in combination, which actually retrospectively unravels Gandhi's earlier positions. From 1946, Gandhi related the individuation of the worshipper to another insistence, that is, religion was, quote, a personal matter that should have no place in politics, unquote, especially in free India. He critiqued the RSS and its concept of a Hindu Raj, saying, and these are all in the Harijan from the 40s, religion is a personal matter which should have no place in politics. If a free India is to live at peace with herself, religious divisions must entirely give place to political divisions based on considerations other than religion. Unquote. So this, Gandhi had always believed in a universal ethical core of religions. He now uses this to posit the religious freedom of the individual as against the mere recognition of religious groupings. That is, a group as a plurality of individuals rather than as a fused organism. This enabled him to define a secular state as opposed to discrete religions, religious communities and organizations, and also to demarcate the state from civil society. As I quote again from Gandhi, the state is bound to be wholly secular. The question of the protection of minorities is not good enough for me. It rests upon the recognition of religious groupings between citizens of the same state. What I wish India to do is to assure liberty of religious profession to every single individual. Then only India can be great. For it was perhaps the one nation in the ancient world which had recognized cultural democracy, whereby it is held that the roads to God are many, but the goal is one, because God is one and the same. In fact, the roads to God are as many as there are individuals in the world, unquote. This formulation of Gandhi approximates liberal notions of the secular state, the integrity of an individual's inclinations, choices, and freedom of worship, but the path to this is not directly from bourgeois individualism. Beginning with the near Orientalist conflation of culture with religion, The path is rooted through a monotheistic universalism that finds its true life in living particularity overdetermined by Advaita, and an understanding of subcontinental religious plurality where multiplicity cannot be played out save through a renewed guarantee of individual inclinations and combinations. This understanding is partly derived from the immanent God of Bhakti, Sant and Sufi traditions, partly from Protestantism, and partly from a bourgeois notion of individual freedom. The state here can be secular and democratic if religious worship is individualistic. Gandhi's own term for this, cultural democracy, cannot therefore be reduced back to religion despite his initial conflation of religion and culture. By making the individual the locus of choice and volition, it also refuses a coercive uniformity of practice to all religions. In his constant reiteration that religion was private and an entirely personal matter, Gandhi partly meant that religion comprised an unmediated relationship of each person to God, fell outside the purview of the state, and was certainly not an entity that could determine nationality. He repeatedly claimed, I quote, "Religion is no test of nationality but a personal matter between man and his God. In this sense of nationality, they are Indians first and Indian last, no matter what religion they profess." This emphasis of Gandhi too was overdetermined in several ways. It was overdetermined by the teaching of the Protestant Reformation, in which each individual could make his own judgment of religious truth through a study of scriptures. It was determined by the late 19th century Indological Protestantization of popular bhakti, which had construed it both as parallel or analogous to the Reformation, especially the Sant traditions, and as inherently incompatible with modern rational traditions. Gandhi's emphasis was also determined by radical reformist tendencies such as those of Phule and Ambedkar that emphasized equality before God, the centrality and autonomy of the person vis-à-vis belief systems. So the idea of reason, in this sense, is co-validated by the concepts of an affective faith, an individuated worshipper, and a personal God. Gandhi then uses this idea of the individual to oppose both a theocratic state and the battle of religious communities. He says, "I do not believe in state religion even though the whole community is one religion." He also said in 1947 in a speech that the Hindu Mahasabha, Muslim League, Parsi Sabha and Sikh Sabha could not after independence continue as political bodies. They could stay as religious bodies, and their task then would be internal reform of society. Gandhi had thus begun to separate the question of the reform of religions from that of a shared civic space where all religions existed on a level ground. A secular state and a common civic life was central to Gandhi's repudiation of the two-nation theory. Obviously, Gandhi and Nehru then had both advocated the protection of minority interests, though Gandhi did not give the kind of priority to a shared economic domain that Nehru did. He too, like Nehru, could argue for focusing on common interests. Both opposed a theocratic state, and both pointed out the divisive role as well as the unifying potentials of colonial rule. Nehru asserted, I quote, "a unity of common subjection that made for a common political interest for all religious groups," while Gandhi presented his task as that, I quote, "of bridging social distance consistently with religious beliefs by going out of my way to seek common ground on political fields." If Gandhi had begun by fusing religion as an ethical system with politics, in his last years he was also separating religions from the nation as well as communally defined religions from politics with increasing vigor. This is also apparent in his emphasis, like Nehru, on the popular will to fight communalism, and in the way he seeks the sources of tolerance as much from compacts of decency and civility the political discourse of nationalism and the rights of minorities as from religions. So tolerance was not just something that was going to come out of, the inherent ethical core of religions. Rather, tolerance, I quote, he says, was necessary for the evolution of democracy, which rests on open-mindedness. Tolerance was the requirement of common citizenship, as well as an effect of the sense of common brotherhood through common citizenship newly attained. And to this, Gandhi also added that tolerance was something that had to be made. It was not something that existed evenly on the social ground. Now, in contrast to Savarkar and Golwakar's fusion of religion and culture, Gandhi had begun to separate religion from culture in his arguments against the two-nation theory. The nation, as well as regional commonalities and cohesions, according to him, undercut religious differences. Religious differences were not absolute, but flexible even in matters of the law. And there were so many cultural commonalities that religious differences could not be decisive. In Noakhali, for instance, he urged people to realize their common concerns as weavers, fishermen, and farmers, and to forget religious affiliations. The striking similarity here between Nehru's projection of a composite culture, there is also a striking similarity, and Gandhi's definition of cultural commonalities to dispute communal positions, the two-nation theory, and partition sentiments. It is also, I think, really important that in 1947, Gandhi withdrew his lifelong opposition to interreligious marriage, thus acknowledging that different faiths could coexist in a family. In fact, the very fact that different faiths could coexist in a family was one of the grounds on which both Nehru and Gandhi then, at this time, came to think about what common culture might mean. Again in the 1940s, Gandhi diverged from the Hindi Sahitya Sammelan, which espoused a Sanskrit-based Hindi written in Devanagari, and stopped using it as a forum for Hindustani and broke from it officially in 1945. He formed a separate Hindustani Prachar Sabha that advocated equal command of Hindi and Urdu for all, in the hope of a natural and happy fusion of sister languages, I'm quoting him, into a simple interprovincial speech drawing new words from a variety of sources and written in two scripts. Neither Persianized nor Sanskritized, Hindustani was designed as a meeting ground between Sanskrit and Arabic, a means for welding Hindu and Muslim masses, and later as the common speech of India and Pakistan. As partition loomed, he devoted much more time to the question of developing a blended national language, in part as a way, I quote, of demonstrating affection and sympathy, unquote, for Muslims. Gandhi thus called upon the joint resources of, I quote, combined culture to oppose communal violence, insisted that the threat to religions came from within each religion and not from other religions. Muslims were now explicitly included as co-sharers in a wider Indian cultural exceptionalism. He suggested a broader ethic for decolonization with multi-religious formations. I quote, "If India fails, Asia dies." It has aptly been called the nursery of many blended cultures and civilizations. Let India be and remain the hope of all exploited races of the earth, whether in Asia, Africa, or in any part of the world. He drafted a code of conduct for governors or ministers of the new nation, which is almost Nehruvian. I quote, for the new governor or minister of India, there can be no untouchability in any form whatsoever, no caste or creed or color distinction. He must represent the best of all religions and all things Eastern or Western. Being a citizen of India, he must be a citizen of the world. Let me come to the last part of my talk. On the 13th of January, 1948, Gandhi began his last fast unto death in Delhi, wagering his life for communal harmony, protection of minorities, and their democratic rights in both India and Pakistan. Uh, for Gandhi, I think this last fast was not to end a particular riot as he had done in Calcutta. It was a fast to restore human relations on the understanding that the fabric of civil society had to be remade both through the initiative of the state and through popular initiatives, and indeed had to be constantly and vigilantly maintained by people. It was, strangely enough, a fast to make a new beginning. The response from Pakistan, as I said, I wish I could actually, go through it. It is so interesting, but it was massive. Even people who had, supported partition, people from different political persuasions in West and East Pakistan actually hailed the fast as a necessary moral act and felt that it should lead to future cooperation. Gandhi broke his fast on the 19th, but only after leaders of the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha, Lala Harichand, Lala Hansraj Gupta, R.B. Narayan Das, Ganesh Bhatt, Basant Lal Narayan Dutt had signed the pledge. 11 days later, he was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, who had RSS antecedents and Hindu Mahasabha affiliations. Gandhi was assassinated because the Hindu right-wing organizations could not carry all the citizens of India with them. It was this popular consent to communal amity that they sought to eliminate while seeking to encash the angers produced by partition. So one of the points that I really want to stress here is that the battle that still continues is not just a battle about two grand public nationalist figures like Nehru and Gandhi, but what they actually represented, who they stood for. The RSS wanted to seal the separation of India and Pakistan. Gandhi, however, had opposed the exchange of populations earlier and said even now that he could not bring himself to accept the proposition of a total or permanent transfer of populations. In his peace plan, when he chose to restore Urs, it was as a festival shared by several religious groups, which had then artificially been reduced by communal tension into becoming a solely Muslim affair. He specified in his prayer meetings that, like Ajmer, the Mehroli Dargah was visited not only by Muslims, but by thousands of Hindus and other non-Muslims in equal veneration. And in fact, he went personally as a pilgrim to Mehroli to celebrate it just 2 days before his death. Gandhi's own syncretic practice may have been equally threatening. He had been establishing the syncretic valences of the fast over the decades. Now he spoke of Ram, but he emerged equally as a Christian figure, literally Christ-like in his offer to expiate the sins of others, willing to punish himself in order to activate a public conscience. At the same time, Gandhi remained a severe critic of Pakistan's failure to ensure the safety of minorities, especially after the Karachi riot, and his fast was explicitly ended to press Pakistan into a counter gesture, so that he was asking of the same guarantees from Pakistan that he was seeking from India. Of course, there were many casualties in Gandhi's change of position, which unfortunately I don't have the time to go into here. One of the casualties, in fact, was his position on women. Gandhi had been one of the nationalists, important nationalists who gave a limited agency to good women, and often in fact essentialized women as being good. And he was really upset when he saw women behaving in majoritarian fashions and attacking minorities. And in fact, he told Hindu women to restrain their menfolk from committing atrocities on Muslim women because it would amount to violating your own honor, since Muslim women are your sisters. However, Gandhi could women could no longer be the essence of non-violence per se for Gandhi. I think this was a great casualty in terms of his personal beliefs. Nor was the mere entry of women into the political domain now sufficient. Rather, women's activism had to be evaluated in relation to the specific political cause, the context of public action, and the form of social agency they exercised. The second very big casualty that I think for Gandhi was his lifelong anti-modernity. Indigenism and anti-modernity had worked for him as a language of restraint on issues of gender, caste and class, but they simply could not provide a viable language for a sustained struggle for Hindu-Muslim unity, partly because they were so steeped in Hindu chauvinism. So in some sense then, to conclude, this immediacy and the range of response to the last fast shows how Gandhi's own moral legitimacy in this conjuncture derived in part from a social consensus. I mean, instead of just getting into the grand man hero theories, let's look at the people who create in part the grand man. It derived in part from a social consensus, if not a secular common sense, that the initiative had to be wrested from communal Hindu and Muslim organizations by both a democratic state and peace-seeking sections of every denomination willing to struggle individually and collectively. If Gandhi was not alone, neither was Nehru. And if Gandhi moved nearer Nehru, then that too was a socially occupied position. Both presented versions of tolerance or respect for all faiths from which it became very difficult to other, and both represented or reflected a similar range of existing attitudes. I think it is a mistake to oppose their positions on religion as indigenous versus Western, because both were shaped by different types of internationalism. Nehru's by a definitionally secular socialism and a liberalism heavily mediated by colonial history, Gandhi's by a prescripted oscillation between humanism and the constellation of colonial indigenism and anti-modernity, as well as the idea of the secular anchored in the individual worshipper that blended an already hybrid medieval devotionalism on the subcontinent with Protestant Christianity and a rational secularism. Neither can be unequivocally said to be within or outside any single tradition. Gandhi's address, however, was wider than Nehru's because it presents a more interesting problematic in some ways, and this problematic is whether the jointing of religious pluralism on the subcontinent with Western secularism can or cannot be transformative. And I believe it is in this jointing that a consensual base for both Nehru and Gandhi will be found. The language of rationality and secularism by the middle of the 20th century had been around for over a century, open to different levels of class appropriation and conceptual assimilation. It too had a social base. It had not just arrived in the middle of the 20th century on a jet airplane from Europe. Further, this language could be appreciated from other experiential bases composed by sectarian conflicts, contradictions between Brahminism and non-Brahminism, the felt pressure of caste, gender and religious hierarchies, histories of cultural imposition, adaptation, religious experimentation, changes of affiliation, histories of dissent, materialism, atheism. That is, from the social and cultural logics of a multi-religious formation. As Nehru saw, every set of immigrants and invaders reformed and recast both inhabitants and the so-called outsiders, while finely honed idioms of assimilation developed, and no assimilation left the preceding formation unaltered. For him, both India's unity and pre-modern tolerance stem from the dynamic capacity to absorb, synthesize and develop a mixed culture. Contrary to general prejudice then, Nehru advocated a secularism that was also in part derived from a multi-religious society. The set of principles comprising freedom of worship, divorce of religion from public life, politics and the state, religion as a private matter for the individual with no bearing on civic rights and duties, were for him not only products of a scientific rationalism, but also integral to India's composite culture. They were not gifts from Europe, but drew strength from their own logic. Significantly, Gandhi's departure from anti-modernity came from an enlightenment-based secularism, which coalesced not with just one, but a number of syncretisms, as well as from a modernist logic of universalism and particularism. I mean, the very idea of a universal ethical core to all religions is a totally modern idea. This prolonged cultural history of collaborations, mutual reformations and antagonisms could not only produce both a Gandhi and a Nehru, but was also the history of social tolerance that could be receptive to a Gandhi or a Nehru, and in fact comprised the felt pressure that determined their respective positions. So then, one might want to ask the last question, was this consensus generated because Gandhi was a believer? Or was it generated because he represented the interests of citizens of a newly made nation state? Throughout January, the month in which he was killed, he spoke in a language of citizenship, civil, political and social rights of so-called minorities and majorities, and regardless of his religious credentials at this conjuncture, the coherences of Gandhi's anti-communal argument derived not from some internal tolerance that all faiths had, but from his incorporation of a very specific set of secular, humanitarian and modern notions regarding justice, law, constitution, minority rights, rights to possessions, property and livelihood, the duties of new governments as the principles of self-governance. I think looking at this, it becomes somewhat clear why Nehru and Gandhi are clubbed together in today's right-wing anguishes, and they are both difficult to completely erase. They are also impossible for them to swallow. And I think one of the things I want to say is that neither of them are alive today. We are living in a completely different conjuncture. The meaning of Hindu nationalism now is solely majoritarian, has no desire to protect economic sovereignty, is aggressively accelerating a neoliberal regime. And in that sense then, I think the fact that Nehru and Gandhi recur on this scene both together and separately is a sign that the social consensus, this secular common sense as I have called it, is something that has also been remade with every episode of communal violence since 1947 till today. It has not died out. And so in that sense, this is, I think, a historic struggle, going well into almost a century. And the point I wish to make in the end is that contra Marx, when history repeats itself, firstly it repeats itself very obviously in very different circumstances, which is what I've been trying to point out. But then when history repeats itself, it is not farce, but rather a mixed genre of tragedy and farce, which is what we are occupying today. Thank you.